The following is a conversation with Chris Solarski. I met Chris in the context of the SAE Institute in Zurich, where I attended some presentations a few years ago and where some of my staff studied game design, Chris being one of their professors. His two current books on game design have quickly become famous and put Chris on the international map as one of the key authors and researchers in the field. His upcoming book, Kinaesthetic Time Capsules, focuses on topics of cultural heritage, disability aesthetics, and accessibility. In this episode, we'll talk about these topics and why they're important in today's world. If you'd ask me how I'd describe Chris's incredible humble spirit, intelligence, and radiating calmness, I'd not find better words than to say a beautiful mind. Thank you, Chris, for taking the time to give us some insight into your work, vision, and selfless steps to make video games more accessible and giving us methods to experience them in more meaningful ways. Stay humble, stay curious. This is the 3D Environment Podcast. And now, please enjoy the conversation with Chris Solarski. Well. Let's get started on this very nice new episode with Chris Solarski. It's a pleasure to be able to record an episode with you.
And thank you very much, Matt, for having me on the podcast.
It is definitely a pleasure. Where shall we get started? I would say just give us a little bit of your background and what you have been doing as a career so far.
Sure thing. Thanks, Matt. Well, my background, I suppose, kind of something that ties everything together is exploring the overlap between traditional art and games or interaction design. And to that end, I published 2 books and a third one is yet to be published. And in support of that, of course, I've worked in games. I've studied traditional art and done oil painting, drawing, sort of many things that have led me towards this specialization, this exploring this overlap between tradition and sort of this kind of contemporary digital media.
So how is this for you? You started to work in video games, right? You've been working at Sony for some time. How long was this approximately? And how many years ago?
Yes, yeah. Oh, now easily. I mean, it's surprising for me to think how long ago is now. 20 years ago. So I studied computer animation. And with that, I was very lucky to get a job at Sony, first as an environment artist and then moving to character design. And I was there for, I think, 2 years almost to the day. There is a story around that why I stayed so short that I'm happy to share later on. But it was 2 years.
Yeah. That was in London, right?
Yes, that's right. So I was born in London. I have a Polish surname because my parents are both from Poland, but I was born in London and studied on the coast of England. But Sony was the job was at the London studio. Yes.
Mm-hmm. But you also mentioned before already, you moved on to figurative oil painting, or in general to oil painting or kind of fine arts. How did you decide to take this step? It's a usual, or you could almost argue, usually it's the other way around, going from traditional fine arts towards video games.
Yeah, that's right. Well, my education was almost entirely digital. So working in programs like 3ds Max and Photoshop. And I think I was a little bit more interested than others in developing my life drawing skills, but still not enough, or at least I didn't realize while I was studying. And when I started working for Sony, the first year was very exciting. Of course, like to see your own work running in like the PlayStation dev kit and so on. But I quickly realized that, if you only have that digital education, then what happens is you usually end up being like at the end of the creative chain, so just on the production arts side, and you don't have so much influence over what the game looks like, or as your creativity isn't used that much, only sort of in a very constrained way. And so after about a year, I realized that the job I would really want would be that of the concept artist. So those are at the top of the food chain, as it were. So they're the people who always get to define the vision for the game and set the work for people like me, kind of lower down. But for a long time, I just wasn't motivated, because in retrospect, I realized that I thought I didn't have the talent to draw or do traditional stuff. But one day I just realized, okay, I'm gonna just sign up for a whole ton of courses. So I was going to life drawing 2 or 3 times a week. Had a painting course on Sunday, painting course on Monday. Used up all my holidays for that, and just through constant practice, like anyone would experience, I got better. And this opened up, to come back to your question, it was once I started learning about traditional art, which was so deep and fascinating, way beyond anything I'd experienced in my computer animation course, it just became like an addiction or a passion that I went headfirst into.
Did you have some doubts? I mean, young students usually have a kind of this notion of that I can't draw. Whenever I draw, it looks like stick figures and so on. Did you also have this notion? And when did you realize that you can actually jump over this hurdle?
For me, it was more a lack of motivation. I think just because I felt that I wasn't creative enough as, say, my cousin, coincidentally, who lives here in Switzerland, in Geneva. And I always thought, like, wow, I wish I could draw with the same motivation that or paint as he can. And for me, it was the realization that, it's talent for me is just drawing or doing anything despite the challenges that come with it. So if you are passionate enough and have visualized, say, a hero, or have a hero figure in whichever industry you're working in, it becomes easier. And it was sort of like this, having the regular rhythm of drawing, financially committing to lessons was a big kind of part of my strategy, saying, well, I've paid for it, I'm going to go. and then, yes, that was part of it. And then just learning so much and having good mentors. I think what helped was that the teachers I had while I was learning to paint were very good. And they were so world-class painters. And so their depth of knowledge was also exhilarating to learn from. And so it does help to have friends or mentors, people to look up to. And I think that's what I often tell my students now, is that, that anyone can learn to draw. Part of it is somehow switching that mentality to sort of have that regular rhythm, know that you will learn through repetition or like constant practice, but also to visualize hero figures, like people who you'd love to reach their level at some point.
What was the motivation for you to then switch and start working on a book or even multiple books?
Well, it was, I think the story already starts when I took an interest in painting, because I became so fascinated with traditional painting and this whole craft side that I realized I cannot learn enough by learning on the side. So I quit my job at Sony to focus 100% on going back to education, not for a bachelor degree or anything or a certificate. It was really just to become a better artist. And so my direction switched already then. I wanted to be a portrait painter. Like, games were maybe a way to make money, not even a lot of money, but sort of that was my main income. But I thought for me, it was like the Formula One of art, to be competing at the National Portrait Gallery, for instance, in London, where you have these kind of avant-garde, progressive portrait painters. Compared to your average game artist, it felt like a whole different league. And so for a long time, I was, in some way, you could say divided, so like game art was sort of like a secondary thing, and portrait painting, traditional art, mixing oils and painting with a brush was my real passion. But it was because I was invited one day by the Swiss Arts Council here in Switzerland to participate in a conference on games. It was the first games conference in Switzerland, and they, of course, had a mandate also to validate their investment in games. Up until then, games were not part of the Swiss Arts Council's mandate. And it was the first time, well, I was invited specifically because of my artistic background, my traditional background. And so it was to speak about how that informed my game artwork. And it was the first time where I actually kind of consolidated or brought these two different disciplines together, rather than thinking of games and traditional art as wildly different areas of design. I suddenly started to think, in preparation for this specific conference, like, wow, there's so much that we still don't understand about games as an art form. And the content for that inspired me to write an article. That article got noticed by someone at Penguin Random House, sort of the publisher, and because they were looking for people to write about games. And as well, with this artistic background, could I do a drawing book? And yeah, that's kind of continued. That's sort of like it's become, that was over, let's say, 15 years ago, and I'm still haven't written all I need to write. There's still more to do. And the topic has changed. I mean, it started as game art, and then the second book was storytelling. But I always thought, or was trying to make the work relevant to game designers. So game design as a discipline of like structuring the interactive experience. And I was myself held back for a very long time, I would say even until this year, by these constraints of like my artistic background, that I was approaching everything from an artistic perspective and quite not using the language and not having the full understanding of like what game design really involves. And Matt, I think you would have noticed walking into the room, the big stack of board games. And that was, yeah, definitely you'll notice, there's no Monopoly or anything like that, Trivial Pursuits. Those are games that kind of prevented me from getting into board games for a long time, because that's what I thought board games represented. But I feel there's been a renaissance in board games in the last few years that I missed, and I've kind of come with a very welcome surprise. And I learned so much just from playing board games. And it was the theoretical kind of link or platform that I needed to finally understand, okay, so the stuff that I've been talking about from an artistic perspective does still work, but I was just thinking a bit too artistically about it, not as a game designer.
Yeah. There's still a lot of people that say video games are kind of not art related. It's kind of below art, or in the sense of the kind of fine arts is art, but games are not, for whatever reasons. What would you say? What's your theory of what don't they get, or what don't they want to get in that, yes, video games are art?
I think it's sort of like an expected kind of starting point for any medium, because we can compare comics and animation to games, and because those are two mediums that are much further along, and you could say much more mature as art forms. And when comics came out, it was all superheroes. When animation came about, it was, I don't know, Mickey Mouse or someone standing on a garden rake getting hit in the head, or Mickey Mouse soaring off the wrong end of a plank and falling, so slapstick. That's because they were, these comics and these animations were made by, very talented people But they were pioneers, and there was a lot of learning to be done. And I'm sure a lot of them also saw what comics could be, what animation could be. But there's even a quote that I use in my work from Walt Disney that he said something like along the lines of like, animation was big, but it really didn't really begin to, hit really big until they had empathy in the thing. Mm-hmm. And games are, I would say, the same. It's the same superhero trappings. That's it's about competition, very much about formal objectives. At least that's how games started off as, a simulation of real world sports of table tennis or adventure games. Because those are very easy to create excitement around. So to create an exciting experience, something that catches your attention. But there is a golden age that we are gradually going into that shows that games can tell meaningful stories around empathy as well. And this is happening gradually. And of course, there is this huge audience. You can easily say that games are way bigger than animation and comics ever were in these early stages. It's, we look at it and you could, as an outsider, think, wow, this is it. This is all that this medium is good enough for. But there are audiences growing and an increasing number of older designers, as well, and younger ones who are entering it with a fresh perspective, who are showing that the games are capable of expressing any other kind of emotion that we find in these more mature, sort of sophisticated art forms. What is unique about games now, like the current state of it, is that the medium is still evolving, and the vocabulary that we have is still somewhat dependent on the mechanisms that we've used before. And it's sort of a challenge to find new techniques with which to express more subtle stories, having designers that want to tell those stories and finding that audience that is receptive to those stories, that does also agree that we've had enough of these action games and we want to experience something more meaningful and, evocative.
I mean, it's pretty clear that games market is growing very strongly at the moment. So there's also, then with the age of digitalization and the internet and so on, obviously games reach much wider audiences, and there's, so because of the demand of different types of games, you can also diversify more in the sense of which types of games can be produced and also can be funded, because it's not niche anymore, but you can actually go into much broader, or kind of produce more games in different flavors. Now, just addressing very briefly the point of that you brought up already a bunch of times, and we will hear much more about throughout this episode, is emotion. What would you say as a game designer? Which aspect to you about emotion is most important? And I see two directions. One is to, let's say, empathize with a character in a story that is given by the game itself, or indirectly, the abstraction of that, the self-reflection of what that story means in relation to the oneself. Mm-hmm. Are there games that should more focus on one or the other, or are the really interesting games, at least for you, the ones that kind of combine both worlds?
In some ways, it's probably impossible to escape both kind of like experiences that players have. I think what games are very good at, and what I focus on in my work, is that, as a quote from a book called Playable Bodies by Kiri Miller, and she has this quote that says that games are the perfect medium for archiving bodily experiences. Because what happens is that whether we do this knowingly or with intention, we are curating a sensory experience, by, in the simplest thing, like how fast does your character move and rotate. So when you decide that I want my character to move to the right, and then I want it to go to the left, there are settings for that behavior, how quickly it snaps around or how slowly it turns around. And just having a conscious understanding that the player will, after a few seconds, start responding to that snap or to the very slow turn. And if you think more consciously about this, the idea is that, I can express something about the way I move or I behave, or about somebody else or an animal or some kind of fantasy story. The idea is that we can embed so much of our own ways of moving that is then transferred to the player, because they quickly start to embody the digital character that is on the screen. And by playing, we automatically reflect on, what is our usual way of moving. So I have one exercise that I start with. It's like the first one is, I always ask, when I do a workshop, I always ask people sort of like from using shape language, like the root shapes being circles, squares, and triangles. I always ask them first, like, so which shape would you choose to represent yourself? And it's a deliberately awkward question because most people without any shape language training sort of like look around and they think, what does he want from us? But it's deliberate to see how embedded it is as a way to, more as a reference than a script for design. And the next one is to draw their own signature. And again, this is something we all design as adults, at least, kids don't have signatures, but there's, we design our signature usually without any shape language training. And then I ask them to reflect on it, based on the shape you chose. Would you say your signature is more rounded or square or edgy? And then I highlight that the way they do it, the way they perform the signature is so natural to them that they often don't think about it. It just comes out. And then I ask them to swap their signature with their neighbor and ask the neighbor to copy or trace over the signature. And it's usually this very enlightening experience, because you're forced to move with the gestures of your neighbor, who you might actually know very well, but they have for you choreographed your gestures by you having to copy or step inside the shoes, as it were, or the train tracks of their signature. And then, I follow up with some famous people who have wildly different signatures, and I ask them to copy them, and then I reveal who it was that they embodied, because our body is like a seismograph. When we're doing this exercise, every single change in direction or a fluid line, our body senses, and we absorb it. We see the line, we copy it, and we move along it. And all of this information is embedded inside video games. The idea is that we also can structure a video game environment on a signature. We can, the same speed and changes in direction, we can embed in the puzzles and in the way that the characters move in the environment. And so when we come to that signature, even though we're not aware of it, our body channels it. And it can seem very jarring sometimes, but usually it's designed to be very fluid. Most games are designed to become somewhat ambient in the way that you interact with them. But of course, as a game that there's no reason why there can't be a game that tries to highlight the sort of the kinesthetic changes that happen and make you reflect a bit more. But it was just a long answer to a seemingly short question. But yeah, it was the idea is that there's a lot of self-reflection that happens because our whole body is engaged in this experience.
Can also make sense that you, let's say, I don't know, action games that are a little bit more out there. I guess you emotionally, you connect less to them, or maybe to, I don't know, some cliche hero aspect that you aspire to, but not really a lot more. But then if you have games like, I never played it, but it looked amazing. What was that game with the little creature that wanders through the desert that has like this long
Journey. Journey.
It's a wonderful, for those that don't know this game, Journey, it was like 10 or 15 years old? About
It's
10 years?
2012 when it was released in March.
Yeah. This is so amazing. And I think the only kind of emotion or the only action you can do next to wandering around and I think jumping and so on is like a little meep meep or so, like a sound.
Chime. Yes,
or a chime.
Yes,
a chime.
Yes, yeah.
And that's so expressive. And I think everybody can relate to this character at a much, much more fundamental level.
Oh, I would say it's much broader than that. We always connect to the characters that we control. There is a scientific aspect to it, but I mean, first to maybe sort of say a bit more about Jenny. It's probably my most cited game in all my work. It's definitely, I would say, without a doubt, a masterpiece in orchestration, because you feel, if you analyze it, if you play it, your experience will be different. But because I've analyzed it so much, it is like an opera. The way that your gestures change and the whole game, all the gameplay is designed to kind of have a lot of contrast and dynamism in it. But there is another aspect of my work which I kind of came to this year, I would say, maybe even last year a little bit already, is how readily our body is willing to abandon our sense of self is already willing to abandon our body, our physical body, and enter and occupy something else. And what I mean by that is that there's maybe you've heard of it before, actually, Matt, is the rubber hand illusion or the rubber hand experiment. It's one where it's like a very well-known experiment where the subject of this experiment has their hand hidden behind a partition or under a partition. And what the experiment has is then they place a rubber hand in sight of the person. And the tester, the scientist, or yourself, you can try this at home, starts to brush with like a paintbrush or anything, the real hand, which is hidden from the test subject's view, and the real hand. So they have this stimulus that is happening at the same time, but their sight is seeing the rubber hand on the table, not their rubber hand, which is concealed behind the partition. And just after a few seconds, they start to believe that the rubber hand is their own, and they extend it to. I've forgotten what the name of the iteration of that is, where the index finger is connected to that of the index finger on the rubber hand. So when they move their index finger up, the rubber hand's index finger moves up. So they can only see the output around the rubber hand. And there's a fantastic video from the National Geographic that I use, and the guy's brain is just blown away by how connected he is to the rubber hand. He believes after he says something like, at first, I thought this isn't working, but now, oh my gosh, this is this is my hand. And there's even more kind of experiments where they've, I think it was a university in England, 3D printed an extra thumb, which goes to the outside of your hand, so the opposite side. Yeah. And after a few weeks, it's part of the people's body. They can, take the keys out of their pocket while being on the phone, and so when we're playing games, evolution, all of this has to do with evolution. Our virtual environments, our primal instincts cannot tell the difference between what is real and what isn't, and we become so easily focused on what we're kind of manipulating. So if you look at Mario or Zelda or any other character in a video game, all of this is connected, just like with this rubber hand experiment. So when I push left on the controller, I'm not looking at the controller, I'm looking at Mario, who's just moved left. When I push right, Mario has moved right. And I embody Mario. And if he gets hit by something, if he jumps, there are neuroscience experiments that show that my muscles are activated, not even with video games, actually. When we go to the museum, if we're looking at a painting with lots of curvy energy, our muscles adapt to that. When there's a very edgy painting. To contrast that, our muscles adapt again. And we are constantly simulating, it's called mirror neurons. So we're simulating the things that we are focused on. And it's very heightened when we play video games because of this feedback that the rubber hand experiment shows so well, that our brain is tricked into thinking that we are the digital character that we see on screen. And the more I research this, the more I teach it, the more I also feel when I look at a game that I'm kind of getting a sense for what is actually happening. So even with, again, I'm apologies for giving you 10-minute answers to sort of smaller questions, but
this is why we're here.
Yes, yeah, it's true, but I feel I could have chopped them up. But when it comes to action games, we still embody those. It's, empathy doesn't necessarily have to be quiet and pleasant. Empathy just means feeling the same sensations that someone else does through the different senses. And so if you play a game that is an action game, we might not identify with, I don't know, an Indiana Jones type character as much as we would with a Journey character, for instance, based on our natural temperament and interests. But we will feel empowered by the Indiana Jones character, and we will feel more that we're sort of isolated or the feelings of sublime connectedness, sort of loneliness and togetherness that Journey, for instance, delivers. So that they're all different forms of empathy, and we will have a natural affinity for some as opposed to others. But games, we cannot help but embody and become the people that we are controlling, or the characters or the abstract objects that we take control of in games.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about also this kind of teleportation that you have if you're deeply inside kind of a movie, when you're sitting in a theater and you don't realize, but it almost feels like your consciousness is faded out and you're fully immersed in this virtual world. And what you mentioned before is kind of that you're literally kind of connected to this other reality, that there's this kind of almost probably literal physiological connection that your body and your senses cannot distinguish between kind of what is real and what is in kind of a linked illusion coming from some other source. This is so powerful, right? And I mean, if everybody knows how deep this connection is, if you're fully immersed in a movie, for example, and probably by far most people also with games, but this is such a rich experience with such a huge potential that we can go so much further with that, with certain experiences. Also thinking about kind of the field of serious games, or even also the aspect of psychological treatment, for example, with people that can talk to avatars because they have difficulties to talk to, for example, human beings because of trust issues. And I do know people that have been working in this field, and it's going to, especially since the pandemic, let's say even online services where you can talk to people are kind of growing much. And then kind of AI companions that you can talk to, AI boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it is. But then also the whole education, psychology, as I mentioned. There's so much to be developed, in not only in the sense of experiences, but also in the sense of personal development and understanding anything you like. This is so massive.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's a good point now to sort of share some of these games that I also feature in my work as references. So there's one called The Graveyard, and it's really just you controlling an elderly lady with a limp and a walking stick down the central pathway through a graveyard, and your mission, you could put it that way, is to reach the end and sit on a bench in front of the church. And that's it. And it was strongly criticized by people who are used to competitive gameplay, and having to master things and winning objectives. But it still uses sort of like game structures. There is an objective and you have to control this character. But for us, it's highlighting that most games, we control an idealized body, someone who's super powerful. If they have disability, they're also augmented and fixed in some way to be even more superhuman. We're athletes, we're sort of like acrobats in Mario, with perfect, abilities. And the graveyard shows us that games allow us to embody bodies that are somehow, we could say imperfect or sort of non-typical bodies that allow us to, experience what it's like to be elderly, experience what it's like to move in completely different ways or see things completely differently. And again, this all comes back to sort of an earlier question that you had, that, why are games not necessarily seen or esteemed to the same degree as film or other art forms? I think that's coming. There's another game called That Dragon Cancer, which is definitely not fun. It's an autobiographical game about a couple whose one of their son was born with terminal cancer. So he was going to die within months or years of his birth. And you play through that. And it's not all kind of just sadness. In an interview, they said that they wanted to highlight that, of course, these situations are way more complex. You have fun. You have positive moments. Even when someone dies, sometimes people stand around and say, that person was so silly when they used to do this. Everyone laughs, in sort of like thinking back to those wonderful moments. So the games actually has fun moments, but also has depression and incapacitating moments, and then again exhilaration, fun, connectedness. And it's through these vignettes of gameplay that are not consistent, are not about mastery and reaching an objective where I can definitively say I'm better than the other player. It's actually, you come to a point of self-reflection and you think, wow, I was those people. I was activating them in this virtual narrative. And so there's lots of other ones. I mean, the Firewatch as well. I usually get emotional. I'll try not to now when I'm talking about it, but it is a spoiler. So I think the listeners can maybe switch off for a few seconds, but it's...
Or 10 minutes.
For 10, I'll make it, 1 minute I'll try. Is a game about dementia, and Alzheimer's as well. So maybe I can get through it without spoiling too much, but you start the game and you kind of are given an overview of the context of why someone is embarking on the job that you eventually take on in the game. And then you play the game and play the game and play the game, and you quickly forget this kind of like intro, sort of that set the stage for it. But it comes back at the very end and you have this kind of goosebump moment or teary moment where you realize, wow, I didn't realize that I was experiencing the world through the eyes of someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, and the fear that goes with that. And this is an aspect of my work that I'm quite proud of, that is this, what I call the unreliable game master. So I think most people, listeners will be familiar with the unreliable narrator that we have in literature or in film. Yeah, sort of like Forrest Gump, for instance, is an unreliable narrator. He's sort of like his perception of what Apple represents, for instance, is not sort of what, his investment in Apple is not connected with reality or like our common understanding of Apple or in The Usual Suspects. But in games, we almost, 99.9% of the time, as designers, follow this reliable game master that the player has to know if they are on the right track to completing their mission, on the right track to, like what is bad move, what should be penalized, what is a correct, what scores them more points, all of these things. And I think the biggest area of exploration is through this being unreliable, where we actually, the players cannot trust us in an artistic sense, where we misguide them into thinking that the experience is about something, and with that comes a sense of fear and isolation. And then at the end we highlight, oh, you just experienced what it's like to be a teenager with, I don't know, some psychosis or something, or someone with Alzheimer's, or what it's like to move in the body of someone who's old. So we can use this technique very, very effectively. And there's some fantastic games that, kind of guide you that mislead you into thinking that something bad is going to happen, or like Gone Home for one, and you keep thinking, I'm in a horror house. I'm going to find blood stains at some point. But the story is about a teenage girl as a coming of age story, and feeling isolated at school and all of these things. So you realize at the end of it that it wasn't about finding a corpse at the end. It was about the feelings that you had, thinking that you were dreading to find something, feeling that something is wrong. And the designers, they designed the whole game about misdirecting you towards this thought, so that you empathized with the characters who were never in danger ever at any point in the game. And that's a very powerful orchestration of emotions, this kind of like misdirecting you for artistic effect.
I mean, how can you not grow playing these types of games, right? It's something that is, I would say, and I agree. I mean, I don't play a lot of games. I don't have much time, sadly. But there's definitely an underrepresentation of these types of, let's say, experiences in video games, definitely. But it's interesting. Yesterday evening, I had a chat with friends, and we were thinking about going to a restaurant in Zurich called Blinde Kuh. It's the Blinde Kuh in German. It's a blind cow. And have you been there?
Yes, yeah.
You have.
Once before,
I haven't
yeah.
been, but it was it must be so cool. So for those that don't know, I guess by far most, so there's this restaurant, and it has been around for about 20 years or so at least, where it's a standard restaurant. You can go there. Yeah, it's based on reservation, I guess. But the room where you eat is completely dark. And it's called a blind cow because the people that are waiters, waitresses, and so on, they are actually blind. And you are basically experiencing their world while eating. And it's complete pitch dark, and you don't see cutlery, plates, glass. I guess a lot of people kick over their glasses and so on, huge mess and so on. But this must be, let's say, kind of a real world equivalent of what you just mentioned in those, just kind of experiencing disabilities or for example, Alzheimer's. So, for example, I mean, my dad passed away a couple of years back, and he had a very rare form of Parkinson's that had kind of a mixture with Alzheimer's. And it's really, really strange to see this from the outside, with knowing that potentially you will be in this stage yourself, but you are not there. So this kind of bridge to this other character that you've known for years and years and years, that is deteriorating and eventually is just a moving shell. That's profound, right? These experiences are profound, and they are very, very much moving and also a reality, right? So kind of addressing those feelings and experiences in games is certainly also not stupid, in the sense of being able to prepare yourself to cope with such situations if they emerge eventually, and they will, right? There's, by the way, I forgot the name of the album. There's a recording that a person made. It's like I don't know how long it was, but it's 6 songs recorded in the sense of the first song is just a standard melody as you would hear it in a normal brain. And then with, I think, the album had 6 tracks. And eventually the songs get more and more kind of mumbled, torn apart, kind of really blurred, and it kind of mimics the process of how it feels to develop Alzheimer's. And I'm going to put the link to this album or to the title in the description, but it's haunting. It's absolutely haunting. And so why wouldn't we as a society encourage to create more of such experiences and actually deal with them?
Yes, yeah, I think it's I'm sort of touched to hear your story as well, Matt, with your father. And I mean, what's even started me including disability aesthetics, that the term, which I think this strongly relates to, is based on a book called Disability Aesthetics by Tobin Siebers. And he highlights that, this idealized form, the perfect human body was so much a part of art for thousands and thousands of years. And now there is interest in this. There's actually, we are in many ways tired of seeing the perfect in everything, and having something that is, in some ways sort of like imperfect, like in this classical sense, is what stands out. It's what creates powerful stories. And he argues, again, not disability aesthetics in the sense that, as it usually is treated in games like this, someone has a disability, they receive cyborg implants and become superhuman. Not in that sense. It's actually to engage with the aesthetics associated with the disability in all its various forms, bodily or mental, cognitive. So that's we because he argues that disability will come. We will all be affected at some point in our life by it through, at the least at old age. If we break a leg or an arm, we become disability is all of a sudden something we have to deal with. So as you say, it's something that has so much value for us to engage with early on, because it helps us to understand each other much better. And that there is, a genuine fascination to be had to explore these other bodies, to embody them through games. And games allow us to experience that in a much more heightened way than any other art form, I would say, before it.
There's also kind of a beautiful depiction of this in the movie Alita Battle Angel, where there are a lot of kind of, I guess, battle-scarred and life-scarred people that lost an arm or a leg, and it was actually replaced with kind of some implants or like exoskeleton parts and robotic parts. But it's kind of described in this, you could say, dystopian universe that the movie plays in, that there are people that are also kind of deliberately chose to remove a limb and replace it with a robotic arm for multiple reasons, and those including aesthetics and also being able to perform certain things differently or quote unquote better. That kind of also goes in this direction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, and there's related to this kind of body movement, or like even with sight. There's one game called The Unfinished Swan, where it starts off with just a white screen. There's nothing on it, and you have to throw black paint with the PlayStation controller, and you slowly start to paint the environment, but it's still black on white. And so the form comes from the paint kind of covering the geometry in the environment. And so we, again, become confronted with, our senses in a whole new way, like not experiencing spaces in a typical way that we would in a film. But there's also one called Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, where you're controlling a character whose lower body is immersed in like a cauldron, like you would see a witch in a typical fairy tale have. And he uses a hammer, a sledgehammer, to move around. And the movement is so awkward. I actually don't know if the designer's intention was to explore disability aesthetics, but it's a very difficult game, but it already makes you think differently about body motion and the mechanics of movement. So there's so many, I would say, playful not in an entertainment way, but kind of like there's so many unusual ways that we can use interaction design to activate the body and make us think completely differently. And the closest thing is I would say dancing, theatre performance, but not everyone does that. I think games have that special ability to be very sort of like much, in some ways, easier to get into or more accessible in some instances and not in others. But it's a very powerful medium for those things. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning of our talk that this is like the golden age is already happening, I would say. It's not that we can go to a game store and we have a horror section, we have a romance section, we have a sentimental section, we have a meditation section, but games are capable of all of that. And in the future, we will be able to say, I'm feeling that I want to become this kind of person for the next 2 hours of gameplay, and there'll be a game for that. I have no doubt that is coming.
Yeah. It's also very interesting in how would you kind of find a system to categorize that in the sense of finding the perfect type of game that matches your mood and your kind of needs right at the moment. That sounds very, very interesting.
I haven't thought that far ahead, but I'm sure there'll be algorithms for that. I don't know, even, you could, reflect on the kind of gestures or, movements. There's always this, I imagine in the future, this kind of thinking, how sensitive our input devices will be. There's also will be ways, again, for the systems to recognize sort of what our body tension is and how we're moving. But it is definitely will be an interesting challenge.
All right, let's talk a little bit about your books. So kind of winding back a little bit to go back to one of those first topics we addressed regarding you writing books. What is your approach in structuring and writing books?
Well, it's sort of coming to a book. I think speaking from my own experience, I mean, I always felt super passionate and really believed that I had something to say that not everyone was familiar with, where it was like a unique angle. And that's kind of what's kept me working almost nonstop. I have my phases where I'm more productive and then less productive, but there's always a goal. And how I structure my work is to have this, the message, and that in a way can change as I start to write. I have had that experience many, many times, but when I write, and I would say it's kind of like a style of mine, it's always very visual. So I think I'm quite a simple person in a sense, where definitely, mathematics and I would say very visual. And if the text is too complex for me to read in other books that I read, then I cannot take that information in. It's like how my brain works. The text has to be very visual. And when I'm writing, I write in a very visual way. And that's kind of how I have also started to write my books, by having images, almost like a slideshow, that illustrates what the theme of the few paragraphs are about. And almost as if I was standing in front of an audience, I kind of, the image in some ways tells me what I have to write about. And I've even started with PowerPoint presentations or keynote presentations as a way of structuring my book. And then, if I need to change, if I have a new idea, I add a new image. Without the image, it's sort of much, much harder to write something. I feel I need images, or I think maybe it would help a lot of people if you sort of used images as a springboard to structure the ideas that you have.
Do you have some sort of, let's say, sparring partner or an editor that helps you with kind of wording things so that maybe kind of needs to be a dialogue for such an editor to understand what you mean, or kind of to fine-tune the meaning so that you can actually translate it into words properly. I assume this happens, or...
No, not with me, never. I mean, an editor is very important, not to diminish editors. So with my first book, I mean, it happened quite quickly, and I put so much energy into it that the editor did an amazing job. Editor kind of finds, sort of develops the consistency in the language, and does a lot of clarification and fixing of grammatical errors, which I'm very prone to myself. But for me, like I said, I think my natural approach to teaching, and even maybe the listeners can hear it in the way I talk, I tend to slow down a lot more, and I try to make concepts as easy as possible to understand and convey. And so I'm never happy with a sentence until it uses the fewest amount of words and is conveyed with the simplest possible concept. So finding analogies. So I don't have anyone who... Actually, I work alone most of the time, and the editor would more be for this formal phase of finalizing the project. But the work I do and is definitely me kind of working over these concepts and teaching. So I don't wait until the book is finished to start sharing it. I often start very early, and my girlfriend was actually quite surprised. She said, are you sure you're, how can you do this? But I know for one that the concepts might not be how they will appear in the final book, but at every stage there is value in the things that I'm sharing, and I might remix them and develop better ways to convey a concept eventually. But it's through this testing, which I think is very familiar to people working in development of any product. So you could say my audience, my sparring partners, that I will often encounter people who don't understand it the way I did, or that I realize, oh no, that was a bad example or ineffective example to communicate this. And so I think, and sometimes, often instantly, I think, that image, this other one will be much better. And so I feel like an old-fashioned music DJ with lots of vinyl. And this vinyl, of course, are my various slide presentations that I had, and I can shuffle through the bags of these kind of presentations and find different images or videos, and or find new ones, new analogies that will help my constantly evolving concepts to be conveyed more effectively.
Your books talk about art, right? It's writing a book about art is kind of almost an art form itself, which needs many, many iterations. And I think that approach of kind of releasing almost like chapter by chapter and then going back and getting some feedback also is much cooler for the audience, because they can interact and actually give feedback. But in the end also the result is probably much better. It's like a sculpture. You're going back, or an oil painting, right? So you let it dry for a couple of months, and then you come back, or weeks. You repaint certain things, and you just enjoy the process. So I think for your type of books, this definitely is a fantastic way to approach it.
Yes, yeah, and well, for me, I would say it's sort of the only way to do it. I think the only effective way. But I do feel, I mean, visuals, are by far, I think it's sort of one of the most effective forms of communication. If we talk about communication and media, then having people read through something is much less effective than showing them an image of the same content. And so that's why I think, I assume your question was sort of like a general one, like for things that people might be able to take away if they are interested in writing a book. Then I would still recommend finding those images, even if it's not, even if it's a book that is pure text. I think having those images there does make the topic more vivid for you as a writer as well. And for instance, I know that Tolkien was an amateur painter, and he illustrated, Hobbiton and Middle Earth, and, what does Mordor look like with his very endearing sketches. And I have no doubt that they helped him to live in those worlds when he was writing them. So it's definitely, I would say, not linked to a certain type of book or style of writing. It's something I would kind of recommend everyone gives it a go if you have the opportunity to write about something. Yeah.
I started about 1.5 years ago to kind of assemble certain things and images on chapters and bullet points in chapters and so on. It's just, who has the time, right? If you don't take the time. But one thing I also thought regarding your point of collecting images is, if the images don't exist, just whatever the core point is of what you want to say, then sketch it down, right? Create your own images that actually make the point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, you could do all, AI sort of generated art is also, a fabulous tool that we could use now as well. I haven't used it for this particular context, but it's to draw it, to generate it, to actually see it and make it real yourself is a huge leap, as opposed to staring at a, empty piece of paper when, anything, the whole universe of possibilities, and that's actually very prohibitive in sort of your, the minute we slap something on that page, some image, we've established rules for what we're talking about. And those rules are very valuable for setting kind of a creative direction for the topic. Whereas when we have an empty page and some sentences scratched down, then it's still one level removed from making the thing that we're writing about real and present, and giving us that valuable structure that we all need when we're working. Like, infinite possibilities are where we procrastinate. We are kind of guaranteed to procrastinate, whereas the quicker we can establish rules, whether they're an image which constrains us, the more productive we will be.
What would you say are the core principles of your work?
The core principles, they've been a common theme for all my work, is shape language and structural composition. So these are concepts that might be familiar to people who work in design, definitely in animation, but where I take them from are sort of the traditional painting that I study. So structural composition, in the sense of how did the old masters arrange their images to have, how do they organize them to kind of chunk the information, rather than have a chaotic random composition. How did they make it easier for the audience to kind of engage with the content? And shape language being as I mentioned earlier, this kind of the root shapes being the circle, square and triangle, having kind of linear lines as well. So those concepts communicated as curved lines, vertical, horizontal, stable lines, and angular lines, and as 3D forms as well. And the reason why I focus on those is that, throughout history, they've been used in art, because they are like the Lego bricks of everything. We can, they're kind of the geometric forms that ancient cultures idealized. And as a 3D artist, you will, of course, use those forms as starting points for all the geometry you're ever going to create. And when we come to games, they are also sort of a way that we average out our experiences with, spherical objects, cube-like objects, or sharp tetrahedral-like objects, or pyramids. And so just the shift that's really I've kind of embraced recently is just to understand the affordances of those objects. And why I focus those, why they are a thread in my work, is because of all the other design principles. We have color, light and shadow, those are the ones that are most closely linked to movement and tactile objects. And that's what games are about. They're sort of the affordances. What can I do with a spherical object like a football? When that object is embedded in a Mario type character, what can Mario do? Can jump and all those things. So we're constantly working with sensory objects, and no matter how cultural they become and dressed up in sort of in whichever way we decorate them, deep down we can usually align them with one of these shapes. And if not, then they are at least a useful comparative analysis tool that we can use. But it's primarily because they are so universal, and they give us an opportunity to structure these kind of simulations of our reality, or kind of fantasy worlds, the world building that we do, because it's tangible objects that we are interacting with, or it's 2D shapes. We can color them, but sort of they're equally valuable, texture, color, all of these things. But when it comes to designing characters and the affordances of interaction design, then these are the most important.
Mm-hmm. Which connection do you see between traditional art and game design?
Well, the common link, when I wrote my first book, the first book was focused on game art. The second was on interactive storytelling. And at that point, and still now, a lot of game designers, the pure game design, the kind of designing the interactive experience, and the puzzles and all of those things, people working in this discipline still don't see the connection, or like to the same degree that I would say, of like what influence does traditional art have on game design. And the typical connection that people make is that the traditional art influences the way a game looks, or how you might compose corners of the environment to use accents in color or accents in contrast to guide the player and things like this, or how you might make a character look more or less threatening and all of these things. But these very same objects, when we paint a tetrahedron or a triangle on a canvas, as we discussed earlier, we have a physical reaction to that through our mirror neurons. And of course, in a video game context, a triangle comes with the same affordances potentially that it would have in reality. So we could use that as an arrow, and that's for a target. Or we could subvert those expectations and, rather than delivering a very pointy, sharp experience, someone might be surprised to find it gives them something more delicate and completely at odds with the expectations that they came with. So it's all the time using this language, shape language, and structural composition. So how do we organize and coordinate everything in this very, very complex world using these systems, but to no longer just as visual inputs, but so thinking about the active engagement with these same tools. So it's no longer like what a visual influence does shape language have on me, but how can I use it when I see it, but I can connect with it and actually use it as game tokens or components in the game. And that's what's really fascinating for me, that I've been talking so long saying shape language, shape language, shape language, visual, but it's like all we have to do is think, okay, all of these things that we use in film, in animation, in comics design, the switch is just, okay, we see these things, but now we can use them. They have affordances that give us special abilities, and we can create them as analogous to reality, or we can use them in kind of half fantasy ways or completely subvert them.
Yeah. I was just thinking about just going back a little bit, but you mentioned signatures, right? Mm-hmm. Pointy signatures and the ones that are more rounded and kind of the characters, or even if we would assign a sphere or a square or a triangle to ourselves. taking this as a context, are there games that kind of take these logical, natural kind of connotations that we have that are also unicultural and specifically use them by breaking those rules in the sense of, for example, that the circle character is actually the evil guy? Are there examples kind of using the shape language to actually use it, but specifically break it?
Yes, yeah. Oh, it's very, very rare because most games do have this formal structure. So formal being that there are winning conditions. You have the ideal path to reach. Like in chess or Monopoly. That there's a formal objective to this all. And so games tend to stick to these archetypes so that characters that look threatening will, be damaging to your progress, or they are there to, in some way, neutralize to reach your objective quicker. But that's not to say that it cannot be done. And there are very, very few examples. So few that I think there's one Nier Automata where the designer specifically wanted the robots to look very round and to their allegiance to be very ambiguous, actually shifts throughout the game. But using this unreliable game master concept, I think that's where it's actually very much encouraged to create these more complex emotional relationships between objects. Because that's what is, I think, destined of the medium to create those more sophisticated narratives. This formal game design is a hindrance to the progress. And I think Journey is one example of this kind of semi-formal game where you do have an objective, but actually your feelings are more important than, definitely there's no high score or anything. But once you reach the objective, reaching the objective is not the goal. It's actually to reflect on your journey in getting there. And so I think that's a very underused tool that we have yet to fully explore.
You talked about the coming golden age of video games and kind of that there's very clearly a trajectory of much, much more that can be developed, also more types of experiences, also to broader and broader audiences. Do you see that there's a similar trajectory to traditional art in the sense of, an oil painter is probably always going to paint oil on a canvas. And let's say counting photography, meanwhile, after such a long time, also just classical photography as a traditional art, which it wasn't at the very beginning. Same thing with comic books in the 1910s and 20s and 30s and so on. Do you see a similar type of trajectory to play with these things and beyond, for example, using, robots to do oil painting? But did you see in your research some cool little new ways of doing traditional art?
Well, I think how I answer this will be very kind of very subjective, I think. But I think Tobin Siebers, the author that I mentioned, the author of Disability Aesthetics, he also defined aesthetics, and I'm so bad at why I mentioned the visual, my visual approach to everything. So to remember a quote is almost impossible. But he defines aesthetics as, our wish to imagine ourselves and our bodies and our futures in radically different ways. So aesthetics in a very broad sense. I deal with kinesthetics, so it's like how does our body motion, how do games affect our sense of our body and body motion. But the body is always a central aspect of every artistic medium or design medium that we engage with. So when we play a video game, we are imagining our body as the avatars, that we project ourselves onto these virtual characters that we control and the virtual components. And I would say that's always been what art delivers. It's sort of this, how is my body, for instance, affected by the industrial age was Impressionism. Why Monet and Renoir painted smoky train stations and at the same time enjoyed escaping the city and painting the countryside or the river life. A contemporary example of that is Justin Mortimer, a British artist who incorporates, his skill has to be witnessed in real life. So if you visit a website and see a painting online, it's only a fraction of the excitement that you'll see when you see how he manipulates the paint. So there is the craft there, but the imagery is often like photo collages and in very kind of subversive kind of ways. But he's using Photoshop and images he finds on the internet to kind of create these collages which reference structural composition in a very traditional way. He's painted the Queen, he's painted David Bowie and many other very recognized figures of our time. But what he's doing is using technology. And again, it's a reflection of, the figures sometimes deformed or sort of injured in his paintings, which is because he spent a lot of time in hospital when he was young. That has shaped the way that he sees his own body. He uses balloons as well as like a metaphor for the body. But using technology as well, he is responding to his environment. If you, I always roll my eyes every time I see a contemporary artist painting haystacks. It's, times have changed. Times have changed. And, if you, again, coming back to this definition of aesthetics by Tobin Siebers, we are always, whether we're conscious of it or not, somehow physically connected to the art that we are observing at any one time. And, using that technology, if the art kind of is a commentary or incorporates kind of modern, sort of these kind of very fast developing new ways of how our bodies are augmented by technology and how we see the world in fragmented ways or experience it. I think that's where I think the analogy for me is, from my perspective, from my subjective perspective.
In this context, do you think that it's very likely, and there's also something to be done about it, that traditional art as a term is actually misinterpreted between the technique, the sense of photography and oil painting as literally as a technique or as a medium, with the subject matter expressed in the art or through the art, and a third dimension also in relation to those times and those local, let's say, cultural contexts. These are the three dimensions that I see that I think should be very clearly separated from each other, but I think it's not often done, which also leads to a lot of, let's say, discussions and a lot of hatred about, let's say, for example, cultural criticism or social criticism, in the sense of, and I mean, this is very often done, or you see this very often on social media, for example, that historic times are judged by the values of today's views. Also the same thing with historical places like landmarks being torn down. Not that there are certain reasons for or against certain things. There's a discussion to be had, right? And there are certainly more extreme examples than others. But I do think there's, let's say, not necessarily a dialogue to be had, but things to be made aware of. And how do you see this?
Definitely, I think there's important to have that separation because, usually if someone thinks of traditional arts, sometimes it's a connection to analog media. So, having a pencil in your hand or oil paint, or it's these, also traditional ways of learning about design, art and design. And I still see there is still value to learn about all of these things with a pencil and a piece of paper. Digital media also just often overcomplicate this, and they also remove our connection slightly to what we're doing. Having a pencil is very direct. You either push hard or draw very lightly. And why I do this signature exercise is because we can very quickly channel the energy of the lines through our bodies just by drawing. And doing the same thing in Photoshop just doesn't feel the same, or working with animation curves in Blender or Cinema 4D is even more removed. And so we lose a lot of that tactile value that we are trying to convey in our art. And that's why I've started using paper prototyping, and even a term, I don't know where it comes from, but body storming. So like brainstorming, but we're actually trying to simulate the virtual experiences, but through real world simulation of our, integrating our own body. Because we have to become, at least I believe, sorry, maybe not so prescriptive, but that I believe, and that if we hope to reach a point with game design as a medium where we can, with authority, and design experiences that deal with the whole spectrum of human emotion, we can't do it by manipulating animation curves in a 3D program. We have to have some first-hand experience, even if it's an abstraction of the thing that we're doing, and holding these objects in our hands, or 3D printed versions of them, or crafted versions, manipulating them and getting our bodies to move is an essential part. And I think this is what somehow is damaging if people do believe that traditional art is something for the history books, whereas that's where a painter with a paintbrush in their hand was feeling the medium. They were pushing against it and making it blend. And digital art kind of separates us from that immediacy. And how can we hope to create really rich and detailed experiences if we're not thinking of ourselves as professionals, or like mastering these tactile senses and channeling them and then translating them? It's better to come from a very rich and maybe over detailed place, and then selectively choose which senses we want to abstract, rather than not having experienced that at all and choosing the most comic, sort of most easiest approximation of what we thought or what we think we are communicating.
Which type of quote-unquote input device for the computer, for digital computer, are you missing at the moment to translate emotion or translate movement? I mean, there's, for example, like these motion capture suits, but there's a lot more that could be explored. And let's not go that far as having brain implants, as are also being developed right at the moment by numerous companies like Neuralink and so on. But as a kind of coming from the art perspective, and because of this really, really almost impossible link of grasping an expression, an emotion, and kind of putting it into the computer, what is it that you are missing at the moment?
Well, I would say it's like the haptic feeling, the tactile feeling of virtual space. Like
in which sense? In surfaces or?
Well, while you were asking the question, I was thinking, like, should I answer this as an artist or as a consumer of interactive media? And as an artist, I suppose I have to do both. As an artist, even working in Procreate, a program like Procreate or Photoshop on my tablet, that resistance, even the stylus, an Apple Pencil doesn't feel the same as a wooden pencil. Somehow I already don't feel at home. It doesn't feel natural to me the way I would hold a pencil. And definitely the resistance of the surface, that there is a dialogue between me and the pencil and the paper surface, that's I already think there are many ways to improve that. And as a player of games or interactive media, then for sure it's the virtual space feels too slick and I still don't have a PlayStation 5, but I marvel at the controller or the haptic feedback that it offers. That a character walking over grass and then running over ice, you'll actually feel the subtle sensations of that, or, even weighted, from one, right hand versus the left hand. There's like different vibrations that the controller can be programmed to, or, stretching an elastic and then releasing it. So the haptic feedback is, like never before. I mean, huge advancements in that. But it's still, I think, maybe to do with the weight of things, I think, more than even the texture of them. I think maybe texture is slowly coming about, even with the PlayStation 5 controller. But I think to feel the weight of your body change, I think that would be very exciting. And I don't have, I'm so focused on my own work that maybe there are even people researching this, but somehow, that's, I think, where we can feel light and heavy, and really the people that we embody, or the bodies that we embody, that would have a huge dramatic impact if we suddenly felt slower because of the burden of the weight of the virtual body that we are kind of taking control of. If that changed, I think that would be so powerful.
So that was the artist side?
That was more the consumer.
That was more on the consumer side.
Yeah, the artist side was definitely connected with Procreate and sort of drawing lines and being creative on the iPad, for instance. And the haptic feedback is, of course, it's parts, that's to have those tools to use as a designer, but me as a player as well, like to, even more feel, light and flighty, as in, once the journey character takes flight, how do you feel that weightlessness and the weight if you suddenly embody a very grounded character that moves slowly. Those things that I think, maybe someone's working on them, but I'm just working on the theory of like why would we even want to simulate that? So, what are the techniques we can use to, make that part of our vocabulary when we are designing games, and how we can use it in more dynamic ways, for artistic effect.
Yeah, I mean, one of the hardest things in, let's say, 3D animation or 3D character animation that's usually a student exercise for early on, is to animate a character that picks up a heavy weight and and then first of all picking it up and then kind of balancing and carrying it around, so that you can actually kind of read or feel the weight of something that obviously is digital and just animated. So that's a really interesting kind of, sure, it's something different, but I just found that this is really interesting in the sense of how is weight even portrayed, for example, in video games, or how do you interact with them, not just with static and dynamic friction, but also in storytelling. The other thing that also just came to mind is, I mean, I mentioned motion capture suits, but the same thing also for face tracking. A lot of that stuff is being developed for games and for movies also, obviously. And the boundaries are being pushed and pushed and pushed. And what's really interesting there is that there are certain games, and have been around for some time, where you have computer game characters and faces, and you have to actually, it's part of the game meanwhile, that you have to figure out if they are lying or not. Right? So character or facial animations is meanwhile getting so sophisticated that it's almost real. We're not yet fully there, but it's going to be really interesting if probably in a few years, not too far in the future, when you may need to lie to a computer opponent and your face is being scanned, for example, playing a game by a webcam or something like that. I mean, it's the same thing when you're playing poker with friends. That's going to be really, really interesting.
Oh, yes, for sure. And I mean, that's the exciting thing, I think, about, why I keep going, because it still feels young. Like it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but there's still so much to define, and especially on these kind of artistic level, there is so much unexplored, and we still don't fully understand, what is like the equivalent of music notation. There's no one way of approaching it, because games are so diverse, and the experiences and, interaction design makes that definition even broader. Yes, I'm super curious to what will happen, and especially controller design. I'm sure PlayStation 6 will show us even more fascinating ways, how, I could imagine some futuristic material where the weight of the controller changes. That's kind of like, or the force feedback, that pushing the analog stick becomes harder, and where, something that's, what I was kind of hinting at, this kind of sense of weight that we feel connected to, like a sluggish character or someone. Yeah. And then suddenly we switch characters and we're kind of very flighty and quick. So very curious, very interesting industry to be in.
I can't wait. I can't wait. So let's go into a little bit of a different direction again. So you're also teaching game design. And so the question is, how do you approach your lectures? Do you have developed specific techniques?
Yeah, I think the one that we've explored already in this discussion was the signature drawing exercise. And I think it's linked to even the previous question you had about this traditional art, or like, what does it mean to different people? And I always, as quickly as possible, try to, if it's game art that I'm teaching, then, I start with this cultural heritage talk where for games too, where students think, but I thought we were learning about game art, or I thought we can learn about game design. It's like, wait, it's coming.
Yeah.
And after a while they will go, I get it now, but it's not to show them how to draw a line, but to make them understand why and what are they feeling when they draw a line, or when they design games. Why did you choose this component? How does it feel? What does it represent in physical terms for the player? Why do they move like this? So it's always, this is kind of the thread, why paper prototyping or why drawing of a pencil is so important, because it reestablishes or reawakens our instincts to, and these kind of sensations that we should be very hypersensitive to as artists, that we are expressing feelings, and, we need to do that with a lot of consideration as well, thinking like, how are people going to be interpreting this, and not to see it as, that those lines look cool, or, this is my style. You have to understand how, what were you feeling when you made that line, and how are people likely to experience it when they see it. And there is very, shape language itself can look almost, childlike, a circle, square, triangle. Kids, child sorting puzzles, the ones where you have to put the square object in a square hole, can be very misleading, and you can think, well, I don't know what is, what are we supposed to take from this? But I keep repeating these things, and get closer and closer to games, or like to contemporary media, and show that we're surrounded by this language, and that's the key message that I hope that if someone doesn't continue drawing after my lesson, or never makes another interacts with another game concept ever again, as long as they next time they watch a film, or see advertising or an illustration, or see a designer table or something like that, that they reflect and realize, actually there's so much information that's being curated for this one object, and how is my body responding to it, or how my emotions responding to it in this interior designed space or something. So.
When comparing your approach to designing, let's say, worlds or games in general, or art, is there a difference for you when tackling kind of a 3D game versus a 2D game, or a 2D isometric game?
The objective is always the same, and what I try to convey as well is that I sort of come at it from a kinesthetic or aesthetics perspective, and it sort of challenges, in some ways, conventional game design, which usually comes at from like, what am I doing? Like the mechanics, the mechanic is a jumping mechanic or it's a racing mechanic, and then we have the game, the players start to play it, and the aesthetics come like as a decorative layer on top. So a common example is like chess. Like a lot of people say, yeah, if aesthetics were so important, like what about chess? Like you have Star Wars chess, Lord of the Rings. No, they argue, oh, it has no influence on the game. It's still a game about combat. But what I argue is they have no influence on the game because the designers of these chess sets had no intention to affect chess. What if, chess is a beautiful game, but there are many instances throughout history where many variants, like Mongol chess, actually has citadels and references to battles that were sort of part of Mongol history. And Chinese variations of chess have a river, a fortress. There is a relationship between culture and expression, and that have shaped these chess variants. So when I approach game design, I always say, what is your aesthetic intent? And, body storming, choosing your sensory objects very carefully, and then trying to develop games, so mechanics based on those, that body storming. What is it you want the player to feel? And that's kind of why it's not MDA, mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. It's aesthetics, but kinesthetics, the aesthetics of motion and body and activity. Aesthetics, dynamics, or aesthetics, mechanics, dynamics. I think that's probably besides the point. But so my approach is the artistic vision, or this kinesthetic vision, being your direction. What ultimately do you want? How do you want players to feel when they play your game? When it comes to the viewpoint, or like this, whether it's 3D, 2D, there is, of course, a lot more richness that you can achieve with a 3D game than you would with an isometric game. But there's also an exponential amount of complexity in finishing a 3D third-person game compared to a 2D game. So I usually say, if you can do it in 2D, do it in 2D. If you have to expand the dimensions, then maybe an isometric view. If you must, if there's no escaping, then do it in a 3D, fully 3D experience. Or, because it's ultimately about what you want to convey. Maybe games aren't even the right medium. It's also important to realize that we ultimately should be versed in the craft. We should be artisans. And that's why it's kind of coming back to why traditional art is so important. Why the Renaissance was possible is because the old masters were versed in poetry, in architecture, in painting, in pottery, engineering, and if you study the craft, it's also to sometimes realize that maybe what you want to convey can be, communicated with a set of playing cards or something, like an artistic installation that deals with games, but doesn't have to actually be digital in any way. So it's also important to take a step back and say, I'm an artisan. I have ideas that I might want to communicate or convey, or I might be working with someone and helping them convey ideas. But, interaction design, whether it's third person, isometric, a side scroller, those are just actually one of several options of a much wider possibility of expression that I can use.
That was a very, very powerful statement. I was just thinking that, well, what would I do in this case, right? I would probably say, well, I want to create a 3D game because I love 3D, right? But what you just mentioned is that technically that's wrong, right? You should have a story first. It's not you're not technically choosing the medium first, because what's the game about? It's in 3D. That's not a valid start, right? Because then you're kind of deciding already, do you prefer the brush or the pencil, right? It shouldn't be about that. It shouldn't be about the tool or the medium. It should be about the story.
Yeah, completely. I mean, that there are, of course, financial constraints or like your business model. I mean, if you're working in games, you took the time and expense and energy to found a gaming company, then what I just said, of course, is kind of, very idealized situation, a very decadent situation, but and unrealistic. But that's the best way to think about it. I think on a very practical level, if you're an indie developer, then for sure, the fewer dimensions to your work, literally sort of in the virtual space, the easier it will be to realize your project and get it finished. So that there is the practical side, but taking a step back, I think it's a much more sophisticated way of looking at it is if we approach it as more these kind of art from an artisan's perspective or like a Renaissance artist perspective. It's like I have an idea first, and if I close my eyes, and in a way, sort of, it's not something I do or I don't admit to, but, if you were to dance around the space in an empty room and try to imagine, what are the gestures that I'd like players to feel, like if I was the avatar, the virtual character, how would I move? And it's an interesting thing that Genova Chen, the creative director of Journey, the game that you mentioned earlier, he also said before the first step that he does in a game development process is not prototyping. He actually prototypes music. I mean, he's very lucky to have an award-winning music composer as a friend who's kind of scored kind of all their games, I think, or at least the latter successful ones, like the ones like Journey. Sorry, they're all successful. Journey, Sky, and maybe even Flower. But he says he prototypes music because it is like what I just described. You can close your eyes and almost move your hand as if it was there's an instinctive response that we have to the music that is beyond the capabilities of all other art forms. And I could just imagine him sitting at his desk and moving his hand like a music conductor and imagining the finger is a soaring orchestral soundtrack, and you could imagine the Journey character in a prototype form, just symbolized by his finger moving and reaching for the sky, and then suddenly the music stops and the finger, his hand dropping, and all of a sudden it's silence and the character has to walk in a silent soundscape or something like that. So it is all about how do you get to that point where this movement, the body storming, becomes tangible. And Genova Chen uses music. For writing, I use images. They're all these things connected. So how do you, what are you trying to say? Why? It's, the question why is used so much in design, so this, I think his name is Sendak, this famous speaker on this method. He's always he's very animated and is always saying, it's like, why? It's like drawing circles, it's like, you don't do what, what do we do? You don't sell that. Yeah. In design, it's the why, why is Nike successful? Why is... Yeah. And I think his surname is Sendak, and his whole business model, or why he's invited is because he's always he's just dissecting companies and trying to find the why of why we all do all this, and it's no different for choosing the viewpoints that you play a game from.
Yeah, so interesting. We're coming back to the why because in the podcast episode I recorded with Mike Shawbrook, we also had a larger portion of the podcast, or a very important aspect or part of the podcast, we talked about this why game in a slightly different context, but it's coming from the same place. So let's talk a little bit about your new or eventually upcoming book about Kinaesthetic Time Capsules. What is this about?
Well, we've thank you for asking, Matt. It's actually, we've touched on the topics already, that, this quote from Kiri Miller from her book, Playable Bodies, that the games are the perfect medium for archiving bodily experiences. I would say there is no artistic medium that doesn't have this capability. She focuses on music, games, and things like this. But even the signature drawing exercise that I mentioned earlier, you have archived your gesture, a physical gesture. And by having people kind of copy that, they are reactivating or re-experiencing that time and space, or like the line quality, the aesthetic quality that you've choreographed for them. When we watch a movie, the camera is probably the strongest link to how our kind of physical connection to that space. So when movement of the camera is very delicate, it's as if we're, and it's moving around, it's looking from one person to another. It's sort of like it's analogous to our necks swiveling around very, very delicately. When the action starts to increase, we are kind of, the camera starts to flick from one character to another, and what the characters are doing there. But so again, it's still very much founded on these traditional principles. I still use shape language and structural composition to highlight how we are archiving these sensory experiences in games. Why it's called Kinaesthetic Time Capsules is for that very reason, very much connected to Kiri Miller's quote, is that we, for instance, the oldest game, sort of to our knowledge, is called the Royal Game of Ur. So it was invented some 4,000 years ago in the region of modern-day Iraq. It's the dice are tetrahedral dice, so forms, so they have quite a spiky texture to them. And the board was said to resemble, or we believe, or some believe, it has like a somewhat of a human form to it, excluding the head, that it represented or symbolized movements through the body and the senses. It feels to play a bit like Ludo, where you start on one side and you have to roll dice and try to get to the other without getting captured. If someone lands on your square, you have to go back. But what I find powerful is that when we play a copy of this original game, we are moving in the same way that players did 4,000 years ago. We are feeling the same forms they did, with bodies that were very similar to people, if not identical to those of 4,000 years ago. That game was played, across Asia and the Middle East. It was found in places as far apart as Crete and Sri Lanka. And 4,000 years later, assuming our interpretations of the rule are somewhat accurate, we have that ability to re-experience the same senses in a different cultural setting, but the same body motion and tactile sensations that this board game offers. When we play video games, we have the opportunity, when we design video games, thinking from this perspective that we are creating kinesthetic time capsules. So a kinesthetic experience. So again, focusing on body motion and how we perceive our own body, and thinking of it as a time capsule. I find that an incredibly powerful and, I would say, somewhat original approach to designing games. Again, it's sort of moving away from what am I doing, what do I have to achieve, to thinking, what is the player, what is the transient being that they will become while playing my games? So like, how am I going to transform them for that 1 hour, 2 hours, or 6 hours, and making sure, sort of using the method is making sure that it's not a one-dimensional experience, that they actually change several times in the course of that experience. So that's what my book is about. So it's giving designers the tools to prototype these using paper means and body storming, and to highlight that how valuable these techniques are when we translate them to digital spaces using these kind of concept of mirror neurons and the rubber hand illusion, to highlight that there is a powerful connection, and that's starting in the real world to try to simulate virtual activities adds so much richness to our experience. Sort of like what we produce at the end of it.
at the moment, there's also kind of a subtitle to the book at the moment that is a game design method celebrating cultural heritage and identity. So that, for example, one of those aspects you mentioned, cultural heritage in the sense of reliving, for example, this game world that, or this, of 4,000 years. But can you expand a little bit more on the meaning of the kind of the second part of the title that you have with celebrating cultural heritage and identity? Because cultural heritage, I know the term obviously from things like important locations in the sense of UNESCO World Heritage, for example. But in your context, you're using a slightly, let's say, different meaning, or maybe can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think it is something that probably means heritage itself means something different to different people. But for me, cultural heritage is, I would say, has two aspects to it as a subtitle for my book. One is to conserve this knowledge that of shape language and structural heritage, as well as the historic games, the variants of chess. We also explore and the evolution of dice, playing dice, how they were connected to the body, and how also culture shaped these games, and culture are very closely intertwined. And at the same time, the tools I give, I also highlight that they work at a very deep structural level, that, I have my culture, or the culture that I've been in contact with, has shaped the way that I understand the world. But lines, shapes, and volumes are universal. They are, and it doesn't matter which culture you come from, how you experience copying a signature is something universal. Like the physical motion of interacting with the structure is something that every artist can use. How they decorate it, using Indian culture or Japanese culture, that's the decorative layer. But I want to highlight that, it's this celebration of culture, like universal culture, like the instances where shape language has been used in even things like Buddha's representations of Buddha, for instance, or how Maori, the haka dance, is used to energize the body using kind of violent, angular gestures. There are so many instances across culture where you can use shape language to make connections. And that's why where I would say a creativity is the ability to make abstract connections, which other people might not. And so through shape language, we become empowered to make connection between Donald Trump's signature, a Lamborghini, and the tooth of a shark, for instance. You might think, what is there? But when you start to look at shape language, you start to see, there's an unexpected, but there is a connection that we can make. So coming back to your question, so cultural heritage is one, respecting traditional art forms in a digital age in the context of game design and interaction design. And the other is the giving people from wildly various cultures the tools to conserve their culture, to convey it through a digital medium or an analog medium as well, and or to express their own identity. So this kind of self-expression.
I really like this approach of having something that is kind of a primordial baseline of almost an axiomatic view of expression that is unicultural. And then the second, you described it as a layer, or kind of as a, what was the word that you were using? Not flavor, it's like a...
there's I usually say that I sort of together, me and the students or participants in the workshop, that we activate our X-ray vision. We are trying to see this structural skeleton of the experience, this structural composition and the shape language, and the decorative layer on top is this kind of the cultural aspect of it. Yes, yeah.
I really like that notion, so you can kind of separate the different elements, which allows you to have, let's say, language or communication on multiple levels, which also would enable you to experience aspects of different cultures also, in the sense of because you can quote unquote verbalize them. And that is, for me, how I would traditionally access this knowledge is either by reading books or by traveling. But why not video games, for example, right? This is tremendously important, I think, also with the more people we are on the planet to start learning to live together. But this is also very, very interesting in the sense of, if you're interested, I hope you are, to experience aspects of other cultures. And I mean, just to break it down into a language, into a layered language. This is so powerful.
That's why I love my work. I mean, that's what kind of drives me to keep getting better at it. So I have one paper prototyping or a game using everyday components. So you just use dice for this one. So it's called Dancing on Dice, with a reference to like these cheap TV shows. And the idea is that you take something like 5 dice, you roll them and you arrange them in any composition that you want, with the intention of mapping the pips on each die to mask with masking tape on the ground. So you'll eventually have to dance across those. So it's like using the randomness of the die rolls. And what makes it trickier is that you have to hold a die between your finger and a dance partner's. And so this kind of tentative connection, you're trying to keep, you don't want to drop it, and you're both pushing at the die from opposite sides. So this kind of amplifies any subtle movement they have. They make a movement, you kind of feel it instantly amplified in your finger, and you have to respond. If you feel that they're moving forward, then you feel that in a very amplified way. I was very lucky to teach it to a workshop of participants in India remotely. So I was sitting here in Zurich, and all I did was, through our Zoom meeting, told them how to play the game, how to set it up. They have very similar dice that I have here in Zurich. But I always encourage the participants to make it their own. So if they have ideas, so one participant did a wonderful iteration on it. So he, instead of using the die for the actual contact point, he took a plate, which was kind of like, so the 2 dancers are pushing their palms up against it and their fingers. And that created way more possibilities for movement as they were kind of dancing across this choreography of masking tape spots on the ground inspired by the dice. And in the video, I could see they were playing Indian music in the background as well. And so already we have something that's, anyone, you could prescribe this. You could say, okay, this is how you play the game. And this is specifically this music you have to listen to, or pick any music you want, and already we have this fascinating connection between the skeleton of the experience, this kind of fundamental layer, and the decorative layer, which, again, can be shaped and, influenced by, whichever culture you choose to reference. But dice connect us all there, and even there's a whole topic, what does a dice, when you think of a die, what does that mean to you? And, we have stick die, the original game of chess was played with stick dice, elongated ones. How do you throw those? And then I heard that there's even a gendered way in Indian culture that some people not everyone is aware of, apparently, that women would throw it a particular way, boys a different way. There are spherical die. If you play tabletop board games, you'll know you can get die in the shape of a wizard's hat, that's or a book, wizard's book, or a mace or something like that. So my son has a Ninjago spinner die, which references the way of the spinjitzu in Ninjago. So dice also themselves are cultural, and we tend, but even taking this one that's, most cultures are familiar with, the D6 die, it's made of resin or something. It's still that already has so much potential for rethinking, what affordances does it give me as an object? And, why is it this shape? Why, what emotional value does it give me, or what affordances does it give me? And then, when you start to add the cultural decorative layer on top, but there's always an influence, once you start to mix these things together, then there's always potential to find new solutions out of necessity. It's always, you iterate because there's a need to iterate.
Very, very nice. So can you share some of the key insight in the research that you have or that you found, or new concept that you developed during your research for Kinaesthetic Time Capsules?
I think we've already touched on this as sort of like what is the physical value of virtual objects, and that was with this rubber hand illusion, and the sort of the amazing value that in itself adds to paper prototyping and understanding, even watching a movie, how physically connected we are to objects that we focus on or activities that we focus on. I mean, I was so excited to discover, these board games like King of Tokyo, even chess. I always imagined it to be a game played by two old bearded white men, playing over a telegram or something, or letters that take months to reach as they plot their next move. But, it's such a beautiful game. So even though I probably lose most matches, I still love playing it, and realizing that for most people, chess is actually gives a lot of adrenaline. I mean, most games are played 10 minutes long, some are 3 minutes long. And that is a completely different experience and exhilarating. And so I think definitely playing board games and kind of immersing, there's so many really cool examples these days that, have almost, for me, no resemblance to Monopoly or Trivial Pursuit or something like that. That was a real game changer, to use a pun accidentally. But that really, I think, had a huge influence on the kind of reinterpreting my own techniques. Like it was like, I thought I knew what I was writing about until, and it was a fun experience as well to see my concepts evolve and realize that there's so much more to it. And it sometimes happens in that way, that I'm thought of an exercise for my students to do, and I do it for months and months and months, and then I suddenly have this realization of how are they interpreting it. Like, and I realize that it's even deeper than what I thought I was communicating. And it's a very exciting experience to come across these things. Yeah.
Lucky coincidence.
Yeah.
All right. So how do you perceive the current state of the video games industry?
I mean, it's a very exciting time. We're still seeing, Assassin's Creed, whichever sequel it is, and Halo, and all of these big franchises. And, there will always be a place for them. There will always be a place for, sports simulations in video game form. There'll always be, for entertainment, they won't go away. What is exciting is to see, through the democratization of game development, now we have Unreal Engine, Unity. They're quite complex, comparatively complex, but they're free. Publishing platforms, it's possible to, have your game published and have people around the world playing it. There's Scratch and the other ones which are, more on the 2D side of platforms. And all of this is empowering people to tell these quirky or unusual or unexpected stories, and so that's why I mentioned this golden age, that it is already happening gradually, but of course the dominant voice is still the games that make the biggest money, and Fortnite and all of those, and not to diminish their value, because they are popular, because people find enjoyment in them, they find value in them. But I think they will become still popular, but it's like, will the Hollywood action movie ever disappear? No. But and And does Hollywood still have a dominant voice even in the most kind of meaningful stories? It still shapes. We watched Napoleon yesterday, and the female characters were side notes, even though their value for Napoleon were way more meaningful than Ridley Scott's sort of bothered to communicate. There'll still be this tension in the future, but for video games as well, how the Hollywood equivalent shapes game design or our general impression of what games are. But there is the art house voice of equivalent of games, which will become stronger and stronger, and we will have these genres and kind of like experiences that equivalent of like I'm stressed, I'll go to yoga. There'll be games that have a narrative that makes you feel this kind of sense of relaxation and connection that you would look through currently through other activities, but there'll be games that through a narrative let you experience that too.
The technique or technology to actually make them accessible. We kind of mentioned this idea at the very early on in this episode. I guess going to be a challenge because not everybody is savvy in using all of those tools like Steam and so on to even access them and are not even aware of that they exist. So I think even in that there's a huge potential. But what I actually find really, really cool and inspiring and very, very positive is that you see it as a golden age coming. So for me, I very often have a little bit of a pessimistic view on a lot of things. Now, talk about loot boxes and the exploitation of, let's say, psychology of children for maximum cash out. Not only in games, but in general, like the loot boxes and so on and so on. Just buying skins, all of those things. And then obviously also kind of the dawn of AI now that we're all living through right at the moment with all of those topics on all of the social media platforms and LinkedIn. How can I create like the next Fortnite without any game design experience with AI in 2 weeks? Right, all of those topics that completely are misleading are just pointing in completely the wrong direction with the wrong mindset. The example I mentioned before, do you want to make a game? Yes, it should be a 3D game. And not that it should what it's about. That's kind of what should root the game in life, in the process of creating something. It's not just, do you want to make a game? Yes, but it should generate a lot of money. It's not about the game, right? And I see a lot of this lately. I mean, I have to do a lot of research on what AI is, kind of in which direction it is going. But I have this tendency of seeing a lot of negative things in that. So I'm super, super thankful that you showed me this direction.
No, it's nice to hear that you, that I helped in that sense. But it definitely is a problem, and games are so young that some people have an opportunity to exploit the system and gain more profits, than they will. And it's, of course, our responsibility to keep evolving our understanding, and it highlights, just how young the medium is. The more we become aware of what it's capable of, how it does influence people, then of course this will also be translated to the consumer. The consumer is usually the last to know, or the most naive, and it's sort of with like over years and decades that they reach the understanding that the designers, the source, have. But of course this kind of sense of manipulation, or this manipulation is all around us. If we, like a flash sale is, in a store for shopping. It's like, I didn't think I needed a jacket, but this, sale, which is only there for 1 hour, and it's a jacket that I, like the algorithm knows that I like, I don't know, North Face clothing, and here it is, North Face jackets for me. How did this happen? It's like magic. No, it's not. I even notice it now. I spend so little time in supermarkets and shopping malls. And when I go, I'm so aware that I want to buy something, and this doesn't happen by accident. There is so much years of marketing experience gone into making products attractive and display stands attractive. So it's all around us, and we consume. Consuming is manipulated on a daily basis. And so games are, unfortunately, just as guilty there, but either we accept it more when with shopping, consuming, have a little better distance to it. Games are new, and it's easier for people to exploit game systems for profit or design them for profit because they're so new and people are so unassuming, partly because games did start from this, it's just for kids, kind of model, just for kids. And now every time a friend of mine recently wrote an article about representation of women in games, for instance, or transgender people in games. And it was like highlighting, but look at games now, so we have, Gone Home or how transgender is presented in games. He asked for me for feedback and I said, but you have to state that these games are for adults, because your average reader will read this and say transgender, but this games are for kids. What are our kids playing? And you have to highlight that games are changing. They're not the same as they used to be. And so there's this constant learning experience, and what can they do is constantly changing, and how do they affect people is constantly changing as well. And I remember being in a panel discussion with an academic called Ido Stern, and the question was like, so don't you think games should be called something else? Because this kind of video games kind of is very misguiding for some people, especially reading an article about this topic that I just mentioned, or transgender or representation of women and sexuality in games. It's like, for children. No, it's not. It's, but it's a game. Well, yeah, kind of. And I liked his response because he said, just wait. Just wait. We have this, or like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when someone said video games, we had, maybe it was Pac-Man or something, or, and in 10 years time, when you say video games, when we just wait, the image that generates in someone's mind will be very, very different to what it was, in now reading that article today, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago. So I felt that was a really interesting way of putting it, so that it's like the concept will evolve, and sort of what images it will conjure up in our minds will evolve with each new generation.
Oh, what was this famous quote? The only thing constant in the universe is change, right? And it's everywhere, right? It's in culture. Culture is changing. Language is changing. Yeah, and there's a lot of political discussions or societal discussion about these things. About, for example, when does or is transgenderism, for example, or the whole gender discussion, is this something that is for adults, or is this also something for kids? I mean, that's a huge debate in itself going on, and this will take quite some time to resolve. I don't even think it will resolve. It will potentially meander into something else that will be relevant in 20, 40, 50, 100 years, right? And nevertheless, right, what I think is important is kind of the methodology and the awareness of certain sensitive topics, or let's say the types of games that people have access to and should get access to, in the sense of there's the whole discussion that is also age-long, since some like games like Doom or Counter-Strike and so on, that with school shootings, right, violence in video games, all those topics. I mean, there's so little research on these topics, and I don't know, or nobody knows in which direction it is going. But one thing that is very clear to me is that there's no one truth, right? There's no absolute statements that should be given from any side. This is how the truth is, because nobody knows.
Yes. I mean, it is always a complex topic. I mean, my sort of, I wouldn't say I can speak on games with the same confidence that I talk about my particular topics. But, there's always education, sort of like the mental health, all of these things are, I think way more important topics when it comes to school shootings, for instance, than games. They are part of the environment in which the shootings took place. But if you look at mental health or other things, you might find, the support, family support and things, education, probably play a much bigger role in that. I think it was Ralph Costa, sort of a game designer and academic, who said, that often people in the industry sort of say, oh no, games, don't have an impact, like violent games don't have an impact. And then say, but serious games, they are educational, they have an impact, which is, you can't have both. They either don't have any positive or negative traits, or they do have an influence. And so it is important to understand that, they do shape our worldview and, how we see culture and our surroundings. But like you say, it's not a black and white answer. And, I would always, there's even comics, even I heard that when books came along, people said it will be the death of family interaction. It's like, and we would laugh at that now. Games, of course, they do shape, or maybe they highlight, maybe in some ways they accent your interests more. They make, more vivid, the things that you're particularly interested. But someone who watches horror movies isn't necessarily going to enact, anything, or is very unlikely, very, very unlikely to behave. It's just that's the kind of entertainment they enjoy. But it is a very complex topic, and as I said, I think someone else would be much better versed in to go deeper into that discussion. But it's definitely, the games do have an influence, but it's definitely a wider cultural, so it's the context, I think, of the person playing it, and definitely having a sensitivity and an understanding that you are shaping people's literally their body when they play games. So it does come with a lot of responsibility, and that is a topic that's come up in the book as well. That's we like never before, we have the opportunity to shape people's perceptions through the games they play, and that does come with responsibility, very serious responsibility.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And there's a tendency in the human nature to try and fit everything into two boxes, in the black box and in the white box. And it's not that easy, right? It's never that easy. And it's the same thing, right? It's not always video games. It's also the news. It's responsibilities of parents, society, how we deal with, as I mentioned before, also kind of minorities in general, and just with fellow human beings and animals also. It's also one of those topics. And it's not black and white. It's very, very, very difficult. And one thing that I usually, or what boggles my mind, is that it takes so much for people to reflect and take a little bit of time to think about or consider the other point of view. And with that, kind of to come back basically to your work, this is what I absolutely admire about your work, is that you are trying to find the underlying rules that are unicultural, kind of in expressing art, in expressing, you could say, culture, in expressing experiences, body experiences in a universal language, you could say, and giving kind of a literal playground, defining a playground that people that play the game and are interested in the other side, that are interested in playing together, they actually get the means to do so. This is what's missing to me in a lot of the political debate, right? I see so many applications. If your tool set kind of would be extended into politics, then it would be really interesting to see that suddenly politicians have to kind of work together. They have to kind of go into each other's bodies, into each other's cultures, into each other's experiences as human beings. But sadly, we're not yet there, right?
Yes, yeah. I think games have become increasingly present at these even political conferences. I think one game critic or like a theoretician was a keynote speaker at the Davos conference of this kind of political leaders.
WF?
Yes, yeah. And someone who specializes in games was talking and sort of like discussing games as, you know, sort of these artifacts that contain culture and, you know, their use. So it's definitely in games, you know, that's one advantage of having such a well-established medium, even if it's young. The money and reach does make it a valuable tool. It will increasingly, I think, be used as a way of inviting people to connect. Yeah, and there's even just reminded me now of The Machine to Be Another, that I think if the listeners were kind of just type that in, The Machine to Be Another, it's a team of designers who've been using sort of cameras and motion sensors as well to enable people to feel like their body is completely somebody else's. So there's a journalist for The Verge, and there's a video on YouTube, and he even starts out, he says, like, then for half an hour, I was a woman, you know, I had a lip piercing, and, you know, when I reached out to touch something, it was somebody else's hands, because what they did was they had a female actor sitting beside him, and she was mirroring his gestures, and he had the virtual reality goggles on, and she had a camera just around her shoulder line. So every time he reached out, she would look over and copy his gestures. And so it was this rubber hand illusion again. So he believed that, you know, when they put a mirror in front of him, and instead of seeing himself, he saw her looking back in the mirror. And, you know, so this isn't game design, but it's interaction design, and uses principles and mechanics that we can integrate into our own games as well. You know, it's this whole interaction design, game design. And, you know, The Machine to Be Another, you know, it's like ethnicity, gender, body types. They have several experiments where people reach out, and a white person is sitting opposite a black person, and they connect hands, and although their hands are switched, so it's you know, you know, they feel you know, their bodies have switched. So it's a very powerful tool that they're using. So yeah,
this stuff is so powerful. It also reminds me of, in extension to that, to feeling or diving into somebody else's bodies. About 2 years ago, I saw a documentary on transplants of limbs and hearts. And it was so fascinating to see that. So there was this story of a guy that got a new heart transplant. And then suddenly, so procedure went well and the person lived. But then eventually he started to discover memories of something that he had never lived before. So I'm not perfectly sure what the example was. Let me put it like this. Let's say extinguishing fires or whatever it was. And then there was nothing that like this that he lived through in his life. And eventually he started to dig deeper and found out that the organ donor or heart donor was actually a firefighter. And so the whole research of assimilating body parts, there's memory ingrained in those limbs, for example. This is incredibly fascinating. And I mean, we're just scratching the surface here, right?
Yes, yeah. And this concept of muscle memory as well. I mean, it's even athletes use it, you know, before they, when they're training, you know, they'll also, you know, it's before they go up, you know, it's their turn to do the downhill ski or something. They sit there with their eyes closed, using their hands, visualizing, because it's a valuable tool to connect to your mind and body. And that's why games, again, this concept of kinesthetic time capsules, we can consciously use that as a creative direction and say, I want to express myself. What is my signature? I want, I want people to feel what it's like for me to be feeling on this day in this particular moment, or across several years, and how does my movement change? And then those become chapters in a video game experience, and you get to feel me at my most energetic, me feeling ill, me in old age, and that becomes your muscle memory by playing it. It's fascinating medium.
You can grow with these things, but there's the necessity that you want to grow. Otherwise, it will not be helpful. Right?
Yes, yeah. That is the part I have that we as designers have no control over. What is important, I think there will always be an audience for our work. I mean, there's, again, most people will go towards the large majority will go towards these Hollywood-style games, but there will be an increasingly large audience for these more reflective games, or like that evoke or promotes reflection on yourself and your own body as well. So, and I hope that's kind of what people also experience with my books and my workshops, that it's, so in connection to this signature drawing exercise, there's also one that's very fluid, one that is very, very, very angular. And what is interesting that I find is that the people whose own signature is very round, they find it very hard to do this super spiky signature. There's something in their body or their thoughts, instinct that says, I cannot outwardly be this kind of violent in my gestures. And I always find that very interesting. So I always say, just keep doing it until you achieve that. And some never do. Something just prevents them from behaving in this way. And then a third signature, which I recently added in the context of disability aesthetics, is one that I found on Wikipedia. I have to say, it's an anonymous person. It just says Catherine, but it's done in incredibly shaky handwriting because it was someone who was diagnosed with Parkinson's. So I don't tell them what who the authors are. I just do the very fluid one, and then the very angular one, and I tell them, if you're very rounded, please do this more than the others. Repeat it until you achieve that, and now copy this very shaky one, moving around, from one side without any context, and then I reveal, you just embodied this person. They slapped their forehead, and I was like, what? It's like, and I say, you'll never meet these people in real life, but you felt what it was like when this signature was done, to be that person, to move like them. And that's incredibly powerful thing. But again, some find it entertaining. Some will start to think, wow, what does this actually mean? So it's, even through education, I hope that, I can inspire people to kind of think more actively about these questions.
Yeah. Beautiful. So a lot of people may not know this about you, but you love to spend your time sometimes in the mountain, snowboarding. So how does this influence kind of your creativeness or reflection on your work?
Something that's even newer, Matt, is I also fell in love with disc golf. So I think you, just to share something.
I saw them in the hallway. Awesome.
But they're all connected. Why I brought it up is like a fondness for the aesthetic line. I think it's with snowboarding, especially in the context of my work and especially discovering disc golf. So for anyone who doesn't know, it's basically golf rules played with frisbees. So instead of a hole, you have like a basket surrounded with chains, and the chains kind of catch your disc and it drops into the basket. That's like the the equivalent to a hole in golf, traditional golf. And when I started playing, I started to think, what is it that I like about these sports? And a fellow player who's a member of the club that I'm a member of, he was once saying that he was a bike courier. And for him, he once said he came down from the Dolder, which is, for anyone who lives in Zurich, is very high up on one of the hillsides surrounding Zurich. And he said, I didn't have to pedal once. He was really enjoying the kind of using the momentum and going around the curves. And he said, and disc golf's just like that for me. And because once you throw it, every disc, for me, it's like collecting Pokemon for adults, because they all have very different flight behavior, and how you throw them also changes it. But the most satisfying one is when you throw it at a particular angle, then it flips up, fades to the right a bit, and then fades. So it has this S shape in the air, and you can use that to your advantage or other ones. But it's once it leaves your hand, if you throw it well, and I'm definitely not, don't count myself as a good thrower at the moment. It takes a lot of practice, but it's sort of seeing this S curve fly through the air. And I've only once, managed to ace. So it's like throwing from the start, and it goes into the basket, and the disc did exactly that. It went kind of this S curve, and then ting, and the sound of the chains. It's like very addictive. And the same thing I would say is like the most satisfying thing when I write fresh snow powder. It's like looking back and seeing those beautiful lines, and feeling the fluidity of that movement. And it's all, you could be, someone could be critical and say, oh, that's a beautiful story. It's like you're using it to add more value to your work. But I generally believe this. This is sort of like, it's sort of like the aesthetics of the flight of the disc, or the aesthetics of riding in powder. It's just, anyone who has ridden powder will attest to that, and everyone who's thrown a disc will also value the line. And when I'm drawing, things like that, they're all very much connected. So I don't think you were expecting that answer, but
no, I was thinking more of kind of like going back to nature, to kind of have a certain distance to everything else. That I would have expected that.
Yes, yeah.
Which I assume that's also an aspect, but I would not have guessed that it could have to do with the aesthetics that you described.
Yes, yeah. I think it's sort of, without sort of going away from the core topic too much. Once someone, I think it was a snowboarder, once defined style as making something look easy. And I think that applies to everything. If you see a figure ice skater, or someone who does BMX bike tricks or something like that, or snowboarding, it's all connected to the body, and this kind of like making things look easy, and the beauty, that the aesthetic value that we find from that. And so it's all connected for sure. Saying that, I love being outdoors, so I think your assumptions, your expectations were definitely right there, and especially snowshoe hiking or something where, especially for the writing process, definitely it's sort of to, block in those ideas, have an image, start writing, and the first sentences that come out will always be rough and, ill-phrased, lacking the true meaning. And then I always, going for a walk with those questions, those rough forms in mind, going snowshoe hiking, that's when the book actually gets written. That's why I'm often, stopping, especially when I'm really in the middle of writing. I'll go cycling, and it's very annoying because I'll stop, every 10 meters to write something down, and I can't help it. I'm annoyed by this, but that's, the ideas are coming because I've blocked in something, and I know that by going swimming or cycling or doing something that is not connected, that's when I'll start to talk, like kind of more freely talk, as if I was talking to an audience or to another person. And that's when the structure comes. So it's never when I'm sitting, or rarely, I will also, like percentage wise, it's less common when I'm sitting in front of the documents, and more when I'm kind of constructing these in a more kind of human, kind of more free-form way, away from the work.
Talking about kinesthetics, right? Talking about kinesthetics and actually walk the walk, not only talk the talk.
Yes.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, so in your field, you are a world-renowned author, and film directors like Mark Forster and, for example, the Assassin's Creed game franchise founder Stefan Asurdian, they have written what are they called? Not
endorsements.
Endorsements,
Yes.
exactly, endorsements. And then you've exhibited it at the Smithsonian's and then South by Southwest, Google, and so on and so on. How do you handle all this, let's say, pressure and fame and still stay so down to earth and calm?
Well, fame. I mean, it's not. I'm not. Well, firstly, thank you for that glowing overview. Well, I'm definitely not famous like Brad Pitt. That people don't recognize me in the streets. There are times when I am surprised, though, that I'll give a workshop and someone will say, "Oh, I read all your books when I was a student, and now it was a pleasure to actually be in a workshop with you." Or I think the most surprising one was when I was coming back from a conference in India, and the art director of Rovio was on the plane with me. And he said, "Oh, so what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, well, I wrote, do you know the book, Drawing Basics and Video Game Art?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "I wrote that," and it was, I think that's as famous, or this feeling of fame that I feel.
World renowned.
Otherwise, yes, yeah.
Right? World renowned.
kind of. But otherwise, I mean, I'm sitting in my apartment very disconnected from my readers. I only when I do a workshop that I sometimes hear, "Oh, I read your book," or, so something like that. And, it's really nice to finally meet you. But most of the time, I still haven't achieved what I wanted to. I hope that Kinaesthetic Time Capsules does deliver on that. And every time I meet people, I think to answer your question, is that it is very fleeting, these moments. And usually I'm struggling with day-to-day work. I'm a father to a 7-year-old, still have to make money, still have to be, innovate. I'm still struggling to find the perfect way of communicating my ideas. And when I meet people and they actually have these kind of glowing feedback, it reminds me that it's all worth it. It's not that I go around. I sometimes think about it. I think like some people go around behaving like that's, in a sense, I'm losing my thread. What I want to say is that some people seem to get success and they go around projecting that success every day. And I think what they miss is that, what keeps me in some ways humble, as you described, is that some people don't even like playing games. So why should I go around with an attitude when it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody? So I'm just trying, like everybody else, to do the best I can, but some people really don't care. And I use that as in a positive context, that's, so why, I'm not going to, it'd be idiotic of me to project, success and sophistication when, it's what I do doesn't have the same value to everybody.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Thank you.
How can people reach out to you or even support your work?
Well, it's nice of you to ask. I think the easiest is to visit my website. I think solarskistudio.com. I'm more active on Instagram, I would say, than other social media platforms. So to connect there and follow me. But I think just, I love doing these workshops. So if someone wanted to if there was some way to host a workshop somewhere, if it's remote or in person, I love to iterate on my work and share, whatever form it is. It's always exciting for me and the participants. And when I'm ready to publish Kinaesthetic Time Capsules, then of course it'd be exciting for people to invest in the book and share it.
When do you think it will be ready?
I'd like to say sort of summer of 2024. I think the skeleton of it is already there. And I'm very happy that I'm already having wonderful opportunities to teach it. And with every workshop, it gets iterated upon and revised. And I think, more realistically, probably by the end of 2024, it's always better to double estimates.
Well, I really hope I didn't take too much of your time off that timeline for you to work on the book. We've been talking for approximately 3 hours now.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's almost 3 hours now. And so which brings me to the just quick last final questions. And actually, this time I added a third one. Usually so far I've only been doing 2, but because we like change, I added a third one. All right, the new one is actually the first one. Who would you like to see as a guest on the 3D Environment podcast?
I would love to see someone like Maria Zborowska or Simeon Schaffner. So Maria Zborowska, I think, lives in the Czech Republic now. Or Simeon Schaffner, who is a Zurich-based concept artist. They're both concept artists who work remotely, who worked on creating concept art for games like The Last of Us 2, for instance. And I was lucky to organize an online panel discussion with them, as well as one other artist, but I'm ashamed to say that I forgot his name. So he would also be included in this wish list. But their situations I found fascinating. They work remotely, they're like me sitting in their apartment or like a shared atelier space, but creating concept art for, these Hollywood-style video games, using, 3D modeling in their 2D, and they're ultimately submitting 2D art, but sort of like their workflows were really fascinating. Their appreciation for traditional art and the relevance to the creative process. So Maria Zborowska or Simeon Schaffner as well. So they would be fantastic people to have.
I'll connect with you to see, to get a precise pointer. Then if you have to recommend a book everybody should read, which one would it be and why?
You kindly sort of kind of foreshadowed some of these questions. So these are ones in particular. I didn't really plan any of the other questions, I have to say. So everything I said tonight was spontaneous, sort of just in response to your question. But I did note the last 3 because I thought that they would need a bit more planning. So that's why I sort of already thought of Maria and Simeon as potential speakers. And when it came to the book, I narrowed it down to a book called The Silk Roads, A New History of the World by Peter Frankopan. And because I empathized with the narrative of what he's trying to do with the book, because it shifts the world narrative to Asia and the Middle East. And he does it in such an accessible way, highlighting, especially growing up in the West, you think that we are the center. We are at the center.
Of course.
And, culturally and economically and things. And this book just flipped everything upside down. And I just, it just showed how important the cultures, that of course the still present cultures, but how the power and the influence was, all around sort of like the Middle East and the centers of power. And I found that fascinating. And it's actually, I've incorporated the spirit of that into my work as well, sort of highlighting, this part of this cultural heritage. It's to highlight that a lot of the, even chess now, it's a game that originates from India, but even the chess pieces, if you buy the highest quality chess pieces, they're still made in India. So even though the companies might be based in America or, in the UK or somewhere, Staunton chess pieces, they are crafted in India. And so it was sort of like the Silk Roads is a really powerful book on this kind of like helping the reader to actually, realize sort of that's how important cultures outside of the West are, I think. Assuming that the person listening to this podcast is based in Europe or in the West, and of course, then I think even more value. But so even me recommending that comes with a lot of assumptions on who's listening and who this book is for. But if you're like me, I grew up in Europe, in England, a bit in a Polish family, now live in Switzerland. I found it incredibly fascinating and eye-opening. So.
Very nice. And then last but not least, if you could change one thing on this planet to make it a better place, what would that be?
So again, of these, as I mentioned, these three questions, I planned a little bit because I really did think that they were very interesting ones, and that's why I wanted to give a sensible answer to them. And I think for me was probably be acceptance of mental health topics. Yeah, to make mental health so normalized and that everyone engages with it, the topic more freely and seeks help, discusses it. I think that's my answer. I feel I could maybe talk about it more, but maybe keeping it simple is better. Mental health.
I think in the context of everything that you said today, I think it's pretty clear what you mean by it. It has been a pleasure. It's been, about 3 hours.
I find it hard to believe.
It went, if the timer over here is not lying, but it's been a pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for doing it. If there's anything last you would like to share, now's the time.
No, I think the only last words are to thank you, Matt, for taking an interest in my work. And I am very surprised that we've spoken for so long. I thought it would be half that time. So I hope there are at least a few listeners who make it this far.
You got one, yeah.
But no, I just hope that it will that people will be inspired to see games in a new way, in the same way like the positive words that you've said throughout this interview, that there is so much more to games that excites me, and there's so much that it's still a very dynamic medium, a changing medium. That I hope that's the thing that readers take away from this. That it's not all entertainment, but meaningful art.
Yeah. No, I have definitely. I'm taking things away from this episode, and there are certainly also a few things that changed in my mind. Thank you so much for doing this.
Okay. No, thank you, Matt. So, I think I like to think I get more from this, also seeing how you respond to it. So thank you very much as well.
All right. I would say this is it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Cheers.